So just because this is such a large audience today, normally I tend to be speaking to kind of local or regional audiences that might know Stenton really quite well. I just thought I'd take a moment to set the stage and let you know kind of what this historic house museum is that we're launching the program from. Stenton was completed in 1730 and began its life as a 511-acre plantation and seat of Philadelphia's Quaker Logan family. Today, it's a historic site and house museum in lower northwest Philadelphia. The site sits within a larger City of Philadelphia park in a post-industrial neighborhood along one of America's oldest railroad lines. Stenton operates with 3 staff people on site, an executive director, a program director, and a curator, that's me, augmented with the work of a resident caretaker couple, a contracted landscape gardener and a contracted housekeeper, 2 dogs, and 1 cat. The National Society of the Colonial Dames of America and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has administered the city-owned site since 1899 and owns the collections. Facilities management and bookkeeping functions are shared with the Colonial Dames headquarters building in Center City, Philadelphia. Stenton has provided leadership to our local consortium of 18 historic sites and attractions, Historic Germantown, and participates in the Colonial Dames National Site and Marketing Umbrella, Great American Treasures, run out of Dumbarton House in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. So I am delighted to have these 3 presenters and panelists with us today for 2 presentations. Before we jump into discussion, they're setting the stage as we are discussing their recently published books. My colleague Rachel Korma is Stenton's program director. She's behind the scenes with me, as is our director Dennis Pickerel, and so she will be helping me to manage the questions. And please do use your Q&A function for the questions, just to make that a little more accessible for us. So we also, I think it will appear in the chat if it hasn't already, have a discount code for both the books that we're discussing today, Max and Ken's jointly edited volume, The Reimagining Historic House Museums, and Donna's New Solutions for House Museums. And I should point out, if you're kind of searching for Donna's book on the web, there was a first edition in 2007. So you want the new one. It's also known as the blue one. So so make sure you get the right cover when you're doing your looking online. So Donna Ann Harris, actually she will be our 3rd speaker, but Donna Harris has worked in the historic preservation field for 35 years. Since 2004, her consulting firm, Heritage Consulting, Inc., has provided training, research, and consulting services for historic sites and historic commercial districts on volunteer management, fundraising, heritage tourism development, and organizational development activities. Max A. Van Balgooy is president of Engaging Places, a design and strategy firm that connects people and historic places. And some of you may know his regular blog that he sends out, also just known as Engaging Places, and it is engaging. So I encourage you to look that up and follow that. Max is also assistant professor in the Museum Studies program at George Washington University. His co-editor is Kenneth C. Turino, and Ken is manager of community partnerships and resource development at Historic New England. Ken teaches courses on the future of historic sites in the Tufts University Museum Studies program and is vice president of the board of the House of Seven Gables in Salem, Massachusetts. So just a little bit to get us started. It might be fair to say, and we'll see how this unfolds, that Donna's book is about kind of undoing historic house museums, and that Max and Ken's book is about how to keep on doing and do stronger historic house museums. So I will turn it over to them for their presentations.
Great. I'm going to start off. First of all, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Colonial Dames. Historic Germantown for hosting this. Really appreciate it. We really want your questions. We're all doing very brief presentations, but we really have left a lot of time for discussion. So I'm going to jump right into this. If I could have the next slide. And I want to say that the book and Max and I edited couldn't have happened without all the authors that contributed to this volume, and that includes Laura Keim. We're very glad to have her, and I know some of the people that are joining us today. I see they're in the chat. Steve Friesen and Mona Lee Dakin also contributed a chapter. So we really want to thank everyone who has contributed. The presentation
chapter.
And Donna Harris, of course, yes. Thank you. And Donna Harris. What I'm going to do today is talk about what grew out of the workshops that Max and I do for ASLH, and as part of that program, which is a day long, which we're putting down to 10 minutes apiece, and the book. So with that, next slide, please. I want to start out by talking about something that I think you're all going to know about. I've been looking at who's been signing in. We have lots of experienced people on here. So again, your questions are needed. And I want to talk a little bit at the beginning about the challenges facing historic house museums. Again, not something that's going to be new to you. Next slide, please. There are more historic houses than any other kind of museum, but there are also more historic houses than there are McDonald's. There are more historic houses than Starbucks. Think about that. Those are ubiquitous. And so are historic houses. And you know what? There are new ones coming online, next slide, all the time. And there's a wide range of those. Most of the examples I've been to, this is one I've not been to in Minnesota, Prince's Studio and Home. Next, please. And this is a really interesting example of a site that is just during the pandemic come on. But I wanted to show you the variety of things. The mission, and Max is going to talk to you very shortly about mission. It's actually the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. And their mission is to seek to advance democracy, justice, and nonviolence and equity for all. That's their mission. If you don't know who Pauli Murray is, please Google her. She was an African-American member of the LGBTQ community, a civil rights activist, a lawyer, the first female African-American Episcopal priest, and she is now an Episcopal saint. And this house, again, coming just online during COVID, I'm wishing them all the best, but they're about social justice. A lot of what we talk about in the book and a lot about what we talk about in our day-long presentation is about social justice, it's about relevancy, and so on. Now, next slide, please. Those are a couple new sites. A lot came on like this house in North Carolina. It was the Silverstein family home. The family were wealthy industrialists. And this is a case of a historic house that was saved by the community. It was literally saved from the bulldozer by the community, who have now turned it into a historic house museum on the second floor, offices, community center, and the grounds are extensively used by the community. So that's the model of saving a historic house by throwing yourself in front of a bulldozer. But you know what? There's a lot of historic sites, next slide, please, that are languishing. I've driven by this sign for several years in upstate New York, and it says it's the future home of the Chatham History Museum. And it's been the future home, as you can probably tell by the condition, for many, many years of this organization. So these are sites that are coming online or come on recently or hoping to come online. But many of us, all of us, are facing challenges. Next slide, please. When Max and I do our workshop, we ask people in the audience from historic sites, what are their biggest challenges? And there are many of them, and those of you working in the field know these. I'm not going to tell you anything new here, but I'm going to focus on the main ones and see if, and you can throw in the chat if these are your biggest challenges, or if you have another big challenge. We'd love to hear that. So first one, next slide, please. Okay. Many of our sites are facing financial instability. Now, this is before COVID, and we're going to hopefully in the Q&A have time to talk about the effects of COVID. So we'll look for those. But even before that, many sites were facing financial instability. Next slide, please. I want to give you a case study. Over a year ago, the Edna St. Vincent Millay House was threatened with closure and started a fundraising campaign and stated that they would close unless they could raise $1 million. The president of their board of trustees wrote in the New York Times, "The cost of operating the site, even with a small staff and an extremely tight budget, exceeds the money brought in each year from donations and visitor fees." You can put in the chat if you think they survived or not. But I'm going to tell you, because we don't have time, they closed. They did close and are regrouping and seeing if they can survive in one other form. And I hope they're reading Donna Harris's book, because that's what I recommended. Next slide, please. And for the overall trends for historic sites, since from 2002 to 2012 and beyond, were of declining attendance. And that's what we had the facts for. But I'm going to come back to this. So typically, this is what we've been hearing in the field, that there's been declining attendance. But I'm going to come back to this. Next slide. And many of you know this. I work for a large organization, Historic New England. We have 38 historic sites we're taking care of, and we try our best to take care of them. For many sites, it's a huge challenge, poor stewardship. Next slide. And you know what? Many of us at our historic sites tell the exact same story. How many sites have you been to where they're talking about candle making or butter churning or spinning and weaving? We have to find out at our historic sites what is particular to our historic sites and our historic site, and go with that. Now, next slide. I said I'd get back to attendance, and there is some good news, and that is there were 3, right before COVID, major studies that came out that pointed attendance had shifted and was going up. Average visitation to historic sites was extremely strong. And you can look at this is a study from ASLH, and I think we could probably just throw that in the chat now if you want to look at that. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but look at where historic sites and historic houses. This is national. There is also a National Park Service study that points to this, and then also a third study from the Humanities Indicator. Now, if you go to the next slide, I'm just giving you, in the ASLH study, they actually break it out by region, and I want to just put 3 of the regions up so you can see. Mountain Plains actually had the largest increase, then the West, then the Southeast, so they ranked them. So if you go to the study, you can read more about this in detail. So there is good news out there, and there's even more good news. Next slide, please. And that is that the American Alliance of Museums, AAM, in 2017, worked with Reach Advisors to do a survey on what Americans consider the most trustworthy sources of information in America. And look what's at number 1, history museums and historic sites. Look where the government is. It's really low on this list. But we can use this kind of information when we're talking to people in our community, and know this in terms of what we're doing at our historic sites, that and the fact that we contribute to the economy of our communities. Now, that's some of the challenges, some of the good news. And I'm going to send this over to Max now, who is going to lead the next part of our conversation.
Thanks, Ken. So as we put this book together, one of the steps at the end is that we have to create an index. And as we develop the index, of course, your keywording every page is that we discovered certain patterns. This book is written, it has 26 chapters, contributions from 24 people, more than 24 people in the field. But by doing the index, we sort of got a sense of what are the things that are really helping institutions reimagine themselves. And one of the things that jumped out was that institutions needed to have a mission and a purpose that was meaningful. And missions have been around for quite a while, 20, 30, 40 years in our field, but they're continuing, they're all sort of, some are better than others, let's put it that way. So, and there's also a lot of misunderstandings about what a mission is. So let me give you a metaphor for this to make sure we're all on the same page. Next slide, please. So I want you to imagine the road going here across these islands off into the distance. The mission is the guardrails on this road. It keeps you on the road and makes sure that you're fulfilling the mission. If you're not, you're going off the side and into the brink. So that's the mission of an organization. It just sort of keeps you on path. It doesn't describe how wide the path is or how fast you should go down this road. And people can have different paths. They can have an asphalt path, a concrete path, a gravel path. So next slide, please. In my courses that I teach in management at George Washington University, the students are given a case study of a museum in the United States, and they have to look at their mission statements, and together they rank them from strong to weak. And I really don't talk about mission statements very much at this point when they do this exercise, but they're able to rank, they can sort of sense which ones are really good mission statements and which ones are okay, and which ones are kind of weak. And you can see that here on the whiteboard. So let me show you what they typically discover as they rank these. And I'm going to show you some real mission statements. We'll eliminate the names to protect the museums. So if you go to the next slide, here are what I call mission statements that aren't very helpful. So the first one is, our museum's mission is to inspire, enlighten, and delight all of its visitors while preserving and enhancing its buildings and landscape, its collections and programs, and its history. This is kind of the variant of the typical preserve, collect, and interpret mission statement that you see. And the thing is that you can replace the name of the mission, the name of the museum, and you wouldn't see any distinction, or they're all sort of the same. So that's not a very helpful mission. It's too vague, it's too big. The second mission statement is, our museum is a unique historic place that inspires curiosity and fosters learning by providing engaging and individualized experiences for everyone. Again, somewhat vague. You can put another museum's name in there and it would probably ring true, but you can see they're trying to be the best of something, the unique. It's the one and only. But that, even being the unique, may not be fulfilling or relevant or meaningful. The third mission statement is inspiring human connections by exploring the human experience. This is what I call the mission statement as slogan or motto. Again, it's a huge, huge, huge. I mean, we could all have that mission statement. Any museum in the world could have this mission statement, but it doesn't really get you very far. It doesn't describe what you want to do or where you want to go. So let me show you how we should think about this, what we discovered at looking at these museums, how they think about this differently. So if you go to the next slide, there are two circles on this page. One is about, why is this house museum matter? Why is it significant? Why is it important? The other one is about the visitor. What is the interest, needs, and motivations of the visitor? What's important to them? What do they think is significant or meaningful? Now, under the significance of a house museum, I put some statements below. These are all reasons why a place could be important. It could be that George Washington slept there, or that James Madison ended the War of 1812 by signing the Treaty of Ghent, or that Abraham Lincoln died there, or that Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind here. All legitimate, maybe some more than others, but all reasonable causes for a place to be significant. On the other side are motivations from visitors, and these are taken from research about why people visit historic sites and why they travel to cultural places. One is, I want to learn more about American history, or I want to learn more about my history, or I want to build a stronger relationship with my family, or I want an escape from my regular life. These are all reasons why people go and visit historic sites, visit museums, go to parks, or travel. Now, our job as people who manage and work and interpret historic sites needs to think about where can we bring those two pieces together. Next slide, please. We need to think about that piece where these overlap, and that can be small or it can be large. The larger it is, of course, the better it is. But in some cases, that George Washington slept here, maybe that has something to do with American history, but it may not help you build a stronger relationship with your family. So we've got to find, we all have to look for, where can we find that overlap between these two pieces? So let me show you some mission statements from organizations that have attempted to describe what they do in terms of not only themselves, but also what they're trying to achieve in their community or in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. So the first one is, these are all in the book, is the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Connecticut. And the Stow Center preserves and interprets Stowe's Hartford home and the center's historic collections. Okay, that sounds pretty typical. Promotes vibrant discussion of her life and work. Okay, that sounds pretty typical. And inspires commitment to social justice and positive change. That's different. So now they're saying, we're not only doing this sort of museum historical agency work, but we're also doing this other stuff in our community to make a difference. Next slide, please. From President Lincoln Cottage in Washington, D.C., they have a mission to reveal the true Lincoln and continuous fight for freedom. So, okay, it's a little bit about telling about Lincoln, but then going on, continuing his fight for freedom. What's interesting is that they added a vision statement. Plant the seeds of Lincoln's brave ideas around the world so that all people everywhere can be free. Now, I would suggest that organizations need to go beyond mission statements and also think about vision statements. The vision is that destination at the end of that road. Where is this road taking you? Where do you want to see, how do you want to see your community change? Or how do you want to see your community remain the same? What do you don't want to give up? That vision needs to be there. What's that goal? What is it at the end of that road that you want to see if you are successful with your mission? I think that's really, really important. Now, there is a third kind of mission statement, and this is rather unusual. It's inspired by the work of the National Trust in England. And so if we'll go to the next slide, this is from the trustees, which is formerly called the Trustees of Reservations of Massachusetts. They have begun to develop spirit of place statements, and that may be something that you want to investigate as a different kind of mission statement. And it, rather than talking about sort of knowledge and facts and names and dates and places, events, it talks about the emotional response to a place and why that's meaningful and why that's important. It's a very different kind of way of looking at why places are important or significant. It's not about getting those facts right and those names right, but it's about the kind of experience you have there. So that might be quite appropriate for your site. So I would suggest that. If you are struggling with trying to figure out what your organization can do, you have examples in this book. And then I'm going to throw a third thing for you to consider. And that is, we talked about mission, we've talked about vision. Increasingly, places are talking about, organizations are talking about the importance of having a statement of values or ethics. It describes if the road is the guardrails on that road is the mission, and the destination is the vision. you can see values as being the compass. So if you go off the road, or if the road is foggy, I'm going to kill this metaphor, the compass, those values help you make decisions. And we're finding more and more that's very, very important to helping organizations move forward and make decisions that matter. If you're puzzled about values, where do I start? If we go to the next slide, there is a place that you can find sort of a starting point. Their history relevance group, you can go to their website there at the bottom, historyrelevance.com, and get this document, have identified working with historians and historical sites and history museums all around the country to develop this statement of the value of history. And there are 7. Your organization doesn't need to adopt all 7 or believe in all 7, but you may find this a really good place. You may find 1 or 2 that are particularly important to you. And because you've adopted these as your values as an organization, you can then make better decisions about what you're trying to achieve and what things you should do, and perhaps more importantly, the things you should stop doing. One of the traps that I find nonprofits and history organizations often fall into, because we're the good guys, we're doing lots of good things, is that it's hard to say no, because they're all good ideas. They're all things that are meaningful, but we don't have the resources to do them all. So we really have to choose. If we wanted, we have to choose quality over quantity. And so we have to choose just maybe 3 things at most that we can accomplish in a year, rather than 12 or a dozen. I remember I'm a consultant, and one of the things I worked with the site to do a strategic plan. And when we got finished, they had 97 goals. And I said, that's just, that we got to stop. We got to cut this down. But it was very, very difficult for them. So I get it. I understand. But let me leave you with some thoughts when thinking about mission and vision and values from the French historian Marc Bloch. If we'll go to the next slide. He was talking about all kinds of scientific disciplines, but I'm going to apply it to history. And that is, history will always seem incomplete if it cannot, sooner or later, in one way or another, aid us to live better. So if anything's going to help move an organization forward to reimagine themselves, is how can you think about the ways for your community, the people who live and work there, to live better? That was going to make the biggest difference. And you'll gain support and members, and you'll be able to better create programs. The second thing I want to talk about that we got from doing the indexing, the big idea that came out of this, next slide please, is supporting risk and experimentation. You know, history museums, history organizations tend to be rather conservative. They really don't like taking risks or experimenting. I know there's some people on this call today who are very open to that. In fact, I had a call this morning with somebody who was asking for examples, and I said, you need to look at Old Salem, for example, what Frank is doing there with when COVID hit. Instead of just asking for money, he rolled out there with a blackboard on wheels and a smartphone and took a video talking about what school programs can do and how students can learn from their site, even though we're all no longer in the classroom. So that was a risky move. It was experimental, and I think it was great. And I encourage you to do more of that. If you go to the next slide, I just want to remind you, Betty Davis is a good model for this. Historic sites ain't no place for sissies. So be brave and take risks as you move forward. You can make mistakes, but it's better to try than to do nothing, particularly in this environment that we are in now. Now I'm going to have Ken come back in to talk about some places that are in the book and elsewhere that are taking risks and doing some kind of innovative things. And I hope you'll be inspired by them. Ken?
Thanks, Max. And I want to give you some mini case studies very, very quickly. And Max, thank you. Next slide. That's great. The Stowe Center, I think many of you know about the Stowe Center. This is what it really looked like, you know, typical historic house. Several years ago. There's a good article by Catherine Kane in the book about their process. Next slide. And what that included was experimentation. So Yes, and here's an example, and it doesn't have to be expensive. They just took some folding chairs, they covered them up, they talked to people. How can we make this site come alive to you? What would you like to do in the site? People said, we'd love to sit down. They got some folding chairs, they covered them, and they had people sit down. They said, we'd like to talk. So they started talking with people, and they decided to rethink based on this 4 of their spaces. Next slide, please. And they created a conversational interactive tour where you can participate along with your guide. And this is actually a tour that I was on pre-COVID. And they talk about issues that were important to Stowe and the anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. I can tell you, it was great. Those are reproduction documents. We picked them up, we had a discussion. I didn't know anyone else in this group, and it was great, the interactive. And they were connecting the past to the present and what's going on today. Relevancy. Next slide, please. You can actually, they use some projections, and they have the actual desk below the projection where Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there's another space for discussion. And then in the last room, you can see on the right, where you have a chance to write down your comments. And this is an actual artifact, but they covered it to protect it and use it so that it's not being harmed for people to write about their experiences in the house. I thought it was a great experiment and has now been turned into their interpretation. Next slide, please. There's a really excellent chapter also in the book on President Lincoln's cottage, and it was his country home and workspace where he spent 1/4 of his presidency. This is in DC, but a lot of people, you have to make a little bit of an effort to get there. Their mission, and I'm just going to read part of it because Max was talking about mission so much, is to reveal the true Lincoln and continue the fight for freedom. Next slide. And what they did is they created a signature tour where it's an innovative small group tour in which a professional guide standing up there in pink can use historical voices. It's sort of like having your clicker and being able to put projections on the wall or put quotes or have sound. So they use this multimedia technology to bring the stories of Lincoln and his family to life. I thought I've been on it several times. Next slide. Very, very creative. You may have noticed that people were sitting on the furniture in that last slide. It gives you a whole different perspective. Here, this was actually a tour with ASLH where the guide was just amazing. They had quotes on the wall, projections on the floor. So it was more conversational, discussion oriented. Next slide. They have a visitor center, a luxury for some of us, I know, where they have exhibitions that relate to the topics important. This one on human trafficking, and slavery still exists in America and in the world. Next slide. Max showed you a smaller image of this, but I wanted to mention their award-winning youth program. And part of this program that brings in people from around the country and around the world is to raise awareness of human trafficking, empower youth leaders about the anti-traffic movement, and encourage others to join, and also to continue Lincoln's fight for freedom. So you see the direct link there. Next slide, please. And I want Max mentioned the trustees of reservation. They based their studies on what's happening at the National Trust in Britain. I think if you Google that sense of place, you'll probably be able to find some of the material. This is one of their sites. This is not one of their landmark sites. This is one of the National Trust in Britain sites. And there they employ this sense of place. And I want to walk you through very, very quickly. I was visiting this with my grad school friends. We do a trip every other year, pre-COVID, and we were in Cornwall to see this. This is a self-guided experience for this house, which the owner, Thomas Charles, after a fire in 1881, wanted to create, quote, an unpretentious family home. As soon as you walk in the house, it's self-guided tour. You see the cast of characters there. Welcome to. Next slide, please. But what I like about this site is that they bring it to life. And this is what a lot of our sites feel dead, to be frank. And they really have, I think. So all the food that you're looking at here is all real. The bread, the beets, but they tell the stories not just of the rich and the rich there. They weren't particularly famous. Next slide. But they talk about the staff. They talk about the servants. And I think we've come a long way and do very well these days in talking about the servants. Next slide. But they also present the information. Remember, this is self-guided in creative ways. They present it on pie crust that you're walking by or on tea towels. And a number of other sites have started doing this. So giving people another way to get information. Next slide. Also, they have a room where you can just sit down, pull off books off the shelves, sit down and rest. They also have scattered through the house the interactives. This young man was learning how to fold napkins. Next slide. And creative, even the use of technology. This was Tommy, who was the eldest son. On the slide on the right, you can see a picture of him that's kind of highlighted on the wall where he's a dandy. When I first walked into the room, that's what I first saw. And I did a double take because the next second, the image had changed. And there he was, the image on the left, in his uniform, which was laid out on the bed in front of me. So using projections that way. Next slide. And they try to make things accessible to children. And here in the children's room, you can see the label is on the floor, a cutout of a child, toys, and so on. Just really, I thought they made the house come alive. You had smell. Next slide. And you had sound if you wanted. The National Trust has a program where you can actually, if you ask permission, play the piano. And the gentleman on the bottom was actually one of my classmates in the Addingham program, where he said, I play the piano, can I? And yes, music coming out makes a house feel alive. And evaluation, have you brought Landrock to life? And all the stickies had fallen off, but they were there so they could get them back. Next slide, please. So we're learning from each other. This is one of Historic New England's newer sites, the Eustis Estate. And we invite people to walk the grounds, enjoy the landscape. The bottom is a sculpture show that I did a few years ago, and we're bringing back a juried show to enliven the landscape. Next. And you'll see that we've learned a lot from the National Trust, but also other sites where now we're allowing people to sit on the furniture in this house. We have technology, we have kiosks in every room so that you can dig deeper into the interpretation. If you want to see a film of the restoration of that room, you can do it. There's also a room where you can sit down, pull books off the shelves and enjoy them. So these are just some creative uses of historic sites, different ways of using them. And someone loved it. Thank you, Amy. And with that, I'm going to turn this back to Max. I just wanted to whet your appetite with a few examples.
Great, thanks, Dan. And I hope that if you pick up the book, our goal is to help you in situations where you find that you're pulled in lots of different directions, or you feel like you're just throwing darts at the wall and hoping you hit a bullseye, or that you're going forward and you just don't know what's behind that door, what's going to happen next. We want to give you some case studies and some examples and some theories and practices that'll help you reimagine your historic site and be more successful. Next slide, please. So treat what's in the book as a toolbox. We've talked about a couple tools today. One of them is mission, vision, and values. The second one is on the next slide is don't be afraid to experiment. And if you are, if you're uncertain, there help is on the way. So you may not have many resources. I always hear this from some place. We can't afford to do evaluation, or we can't figure out how do we do this. So let me give you some suggestions on the next slide. Randy Korn's book, Intentional Practice for Museums, is very good about thinking about the practice of being more intentional about what you do, having a real clear sense of your impact that you want to have. Judy Diamond's book, and Michael Horn and David Udall's book on practical evaluation. If you want to see if your work is really having an impact, I would suggest that one to you. It's a nice thin little book, and everything in there is very easy to do with few resources. And then if you're skeptical about the ability to measure impact or things that are, quote, intangible, there is a business book that has been around for decades called How to Measure Anything. And it's true, written for the business world, but it can be applied to nonprofits and the kind of intangible work that we do in our field. So, however, I'm shilling here other people's book. Next slide, please. Of course, please pick up our book, which have been well reviewed, and including being called a bundle of wildly divergent ideas. So please pick a copy. We have it available to you on discount if you want to get it. I think the code is in the chat if you want that there. So now, one of the authors of this book is Donna Harris, but she is in this book. She is not talking about, she's talking about boards. She's not talking about the topic of her others book. So I'm going to have her talk about what she's doing there. Donna?
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for doing this. I'm here today to talk today about only a handful of the 10 solutions I discuss in my book. And the ones I selected for today are ones where I believe that they're just easier to undertake, that they don't seem to be such a big step forward. But some of you may know that I'm an accidental author in the sense that I won a mid-career fellowship from the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation in 2003 to do research about alternate uses for landmark buildings where the Historic House Museum could no longer maintain the building or open it to the public. I was writing one of these, I thought that what I was writing was one of the old information sheets for the National Trust that they used to put out, but the case studies that I wrote about as part of the fellowship I found were very usable and interesting. And these case studies were for organizations that already had made a change to a new use or user, and I wrote them up as the case studies and they became my first solutions. At the same time I was writing in the early 2000s, there was a chorus of Historic House Museum folks that were talking about what to do with all these house museums that had aging boards or few volunteers taking their place. Ken had talked about them. Most of them had no endowments whatsoever, or they had serious deferred maintenance needs. And so the bigger question was, what's going to happen to these sites? My book finally came out in April 2007, which was just at the very, very beginning of the recession. And I thought that there would be a great deal of change at historic sites as a result of this book, but or that there would be a barrage of house sales or mergers or what have you. And there was change, yes. And Ken and Max's book chronicled some of the changes that did happen. Next, please. But despite all this, I learned from my publisher that my book was their bestseller. I had no idea. And but they also wanted an update. So here I am today with the second edition with 2 more solutions and 7 new case studies to illustrate what is now 10 solutions for house museums. And what I want to talk about today briefly are 5 solutions that don't require you to sell the building, deaccession the collection, or merge with another organization, all things that would trigger a conversation with or filing with the state attorney general's office. I think that these 5 solutions might be an easier sell for you to your board if you've really come to the conclusion that that your closure due to COVID has really made you want to look at other options for your historic site. Next, please. The first one is actually not a really new solution. Historic New England has used since the 1970s. Now that's 40 years ago, 1970s, has taken their oldest, most antique wood frame buildings, and they open them now for visitors only on a handful of days every year, and they call them study houses. If you're a member, you can always call and they'll be happy to open them up for you by appointment. Now, 10 of their houses, these very, very old houses like the Sweet Isley House pictured here, which is 1670, and in Newbury, Massachusetts, is used this way. Some have furnishings inside, some don't. But by the late 1970s, Historic New England owned 65 house museums, and they were located all over 6 New England states. Now, the organization decided that they needed to prune the number down, and they did, to about 40. And they deaccessioned some of the other houses. 15 were sold to private owners with restrictive covenants, also known as easements in other states. Since this move about 40 years ago, they've sold 5 other properties with easements, and they're now down to about 38 sites, as Ken mentioned. But today, 10 of their 38 historic sites are open as study houses, some just a few days a year. And those dates are open, are on their website. But they're all superbly maintained like this one. Their grounds are immaculate, and they're available to anyone by appointment. Now, this option, a study house option, would be a good one if you don't want to sell the building, but the building is too fragile and you're not able to, can't take a constant visitor use. Next one. Another option is Reprogram for mission-based use. I found this one to be particularly useful, and because it had a lot of viable alternatives for adapted use for some of these older landmark buildings. Now, former historic house museums can be converted to a variety of mission-based uses: staff housing, maybe collection storage, the library, the gift shop, or retail store. And here, the 1800 house, guess when this was built? At the Nantucket Historical Association, they took a historic house museum that had been closed because the building needed extensive repairs. And they were able to find funds, a new funding source was available, and restored the exterior and rehabilitated the interior for use as workshop space for classes for Nantucket Island decorative arts and crafts. And the new use of the house opened in 2004, and it's been wildly successful for them. Craftspeople and artisans teach about, people that want to learn about scrimshaw, sailors' valentines, floor cloths, textile arts, and other decorative arts during the summer, spring, and fall season. The interior woodwork here has all been restored, and there's only movable tables and chairs inside. They've got a small catering kitchen and one handicapped restroom. There's no other objects inside. And I believe this has great potential for many historic sites that can either use a vacant building or even create a vacant room in one of their own sites for their own programming, for meetings, book clubs, board meetings, etc. Next slide, please. So many organizations I work with have this particular setup. This property in Deadwood, South Dakota, is owned by a government entity. In this case, it's owned by the city. But your site may be owned by the county, may be owned by the state, and a nonprofit organization, a Friends of group, has been formed to open the site to the public. Sometimes the owner, in this case, in South Dakota, their local government may supply some operating support in the case that they do. And in Deadwood, South Dakota, they've been using this arrangement, which they call a co-stewardship agreement, for more than 90 years. Believe that, 90 years. Since the 1930s, when a mayor succeeded in developing a local history museum, but he wanted a separately constituted nonprofit organization to own the collection, because he believed that that the local government was probably good at like cutting grass and doing painting and fixing roofs, etc., but they weren't good as collection stewards. So that job should be left to a not-for-profit organization. So for the last 90 years, they've had this arrangement where the city owns and maintains the building, and they give some money to the nonprofit, and who open the museum and manage the collection, provide tours and programs. Now, what they found in Deadwood, however, was a proliferation of new museums being created in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Then when I went back to talk with them again as part of the effort to write a second edition, I found that they had said that there were 4 new museums now there were 4 museums, when used to be 2, that were open, and each with the same arrangement. The city owned the building, but there was a not-for-profit that owned the collection, but they all saw each other as potential competitors. So a consultant was hired to work with this organization, the Historic Adams House, for a new strategic plan in 2013. And she said after about a minute, this wasn't me, that, hey, wouldn't it be great if you created an umbrella organization to share staff, cut costs on insurance and the back office costs, and jointly market the 4 historic sites to the public? Well, that took about a year, but they all agreed, and they created this new organization, umbrella organization, Deadwood History, Inc. And this organization really came about with a much, much larger vision than any one of these one individual organizations could come to. And their visitation really has grown as a result of this. They'll be very interested to see once they begin to reopen after COVID. Next, please. This case study is from British Columbia, Canada, and I found it very intriguing when I first learned about it. Here they had a change in government party brought around, and which brought about, right-sizing government. This was in the early years of in the early 2000s, and the new ministers that came into power in this province wanted to get out of the historic house museum business entirely by leasing the 30 provincially owned historic sites to new users that would operate them as tourist attractions. They would call that devolution there. They offered 15-year leases, which they called licenses, through a very elaborate procurement process, and they were able to find individuals, local governments, tribes, and for-profit organizations that were willing to lease them and open them either year-round or seasonally as historic sites. Now, the provincial government offered no subsidy or cash payment at all. So you took the building and with a good business plan, and you could then earn whatever money you could, and hopefully that was enough to manage the building. Now this one, the Emily Carr house seen here, is right in the downtown in British Columbia, Victoria, British Columbia. And the woman who ended up leasing this was the former curator there. And she put in a bid and won the opportunity to open the Emily Carr house for visitors as a seasonal visitor attraction. The site has always had a resident caretaker apartment upstairs, and that's where she ended up raising her family. What I learned from the update, what I did for all these case studies, was that the government agency, the Heritage Branch, came to realize that not all of the 30 historic sites which they devolved were capable of being leased with no subsidy. This site, like 8 other ones, most of the larger ones actually, the Barkerville Historic Town and Park, which is a complete gold village, and Fort Steele, which is a 19th century village, were not able to make enough money from ticket sales, parking, or food operations from their site to pay for any maintenance needs. So the provincial government had to return to supplying money for these 8 historic sites annually. Each one gets money. The whole amount is $2 million on a yearly basis as a subsidy. And the province also has invested over $30 million in capital repairs too in the last 8 years. So these sites have had all of their deferred maintenance needs addressed. But so not all of these solutions, are what the initial proponents had hoped. But the lease of 15 years has been roundly successful for most of these smaller historic sites, and the house museum use was sustained for them. Next one. This is the last one I'm going to talk about today in my 10 minutes, and this is the Kubler-Malara Adobe in Monterey, California. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was given this property as part of a bequest in 1968. And they immediately sought out the California State Park System to operate this site in downtown Monterey. It's a 2.5-acre site surrounded by an adobe wall. and it has 2 small adobe houses used as house museums. And it had a corner store, an adobe warehouse, and a barn as well on the complex, as well as a garden. The trust had 2 20-year lease agreements with them, but at the start of the recession in 2007, the state park system ended their lease and the property reverted back to the trust. In the meantime, there was an earthquake there and had damaged 2 of the 5 buildings on the property, and each of them needed hundreds of thousands of dollars of work repairs. So for them, like, what to do? So the site had always been mixed use. It's 2.5 acres with stores and barns and warehouses. And the trust first examined the idea of perhaps turning all 5 of these buildings into commercial uses, but that didn't go over particularly well with local preservationists. So they began again, and by collaborating with their friends and partners and neighbors, they came upon the idea of shared use, where the 2 small adobes would remain as historic sites, and then the other 3 buildings would be leased to 3 for-profit operators. So the Alta Bakery and Cafe would use the corner store site, the Cella Restaurant would use the Spear Warehouse, and the barns at Cooper Malara would be using the barns as an event space with a caterer as a lead tenant. Now, the grounds and the restrooms would all be shared by all the uses on the site. So this was finally completed in 2018, and the rents from the commercial buildings helped subsidize and pay for the operating costs of the house museums. In this case, the National Trust thought very differently about the use of these buildings and developed a shared use primarily at the suggestion of their neighbors. Next, please. So the most important advice I can give you about exploring other uses or users for your historic site is that you need both time and a little money to explore these ideas. If you're in an urgent situation with literally, change left in the checking account, these ideas I don't think are going to be very helpful to you. But you do need time, months, or maybe a year to fully explore if any of these options will work for you. You may need an attorney to help with lease agreements or co-stewardship arrangements or shared use agreements. But some, if not all of these, are solutions that could be, like talked about today, really do maintain the house museum use, but it's just a different use, different user maybe. So as we're beginning to talk about reopening, perhaps this summer, as more people get vaccinated, and what your site may be like for visitors, perhaps now is the time you consider some new solutions for your landmark property. I thank you. Now, Laura, I understand you have some questions for us.
Yes, we already have a couple questions in the chat, in fact, and one is, I think, really phrased as a very practical question that fits into kind of a larger topical kind of question that I've also been thinking about. And so I'm going to sort of phrase it in kind of hear you talk around a little bit about on the sort of theoretical side. Do we have a colonial revival problem in historic sites? And the question that specifically is asked here, it says, in general, would you recommend that historic house museums not focus on domestic life? Is it too stale? It seems like house museums would, question universally, lend themselves to domestic themes, but should we be resisting that?
I want one of you 2 gentlemen to go first.
I get thoughts. Max, do you want to start, or?
Well, all good interpretation connects what people see and experience with what they hear. So yeah, if you're in a domestic setting, it's going to work best if you do a domestic topic. Where perhaps the challenge is, what I see more often is that people always assume that the earliest period is the most important period. And that's what the house gets restored to. That's where the interpretation heads. And I think instead we need to look at all the periods and determine which one is going to be most relevant and meaningful to you now. The other one is always to take the perspective, the default is to take the perspective of the owner of the property, and usually the man, who's usually wealthy and he's usually white. But many people may have lived and worked at that site over time, and maybe their stories might be more interesting and more relevant.
And I just want to second that. There's actually Max's wife wrote it. There's a good chapter about women's history in the book. I have no problem with interpreting domestic life, but we can focus on the women too. And as Max said, the other people who worked in the building, it doesn't have to be, one set kind of interpretation. You can talk about the people, and I know Stenton does this, talk about the people who built, who made your furniture, the enslaved Africans that worked on mahogany in the Caribbean, and that came to your historic house. So I think there's many ways of looking at your interpretation, but I don't think you have to throw that out.
I wanted to bring it to one of the case studies I did, which I always find fascinating also, is the Alice Paul Institute. It's in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And a bunch of feminists, bought Alice Paul's birthplace. Alice Paul was the author of the Equal Rights Amendment. And so they bought the house and had a mortgage and, paid it off over 20 years, bless their hearts. They got a substantial money to restore the house from the state of New Jersey. So it's restored, but it's not a house museum. They were very particular from the very beginning that they did not want it to be a house museum. They have maybe 5 objects that are affiliated with Alice Paul there. Instead, what they wanted the house to be is a memorial to Alice Paul's ideals and her work over the years to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And so they decided that their main focus was going to be on women and young girls. So they do a lot of programming around for girls in basically junior high or middle school. And it's basically a lot of leadership training. And I think that to me that's got tremendous relevance about how you can make a historic site be different, have yet great opportunity to provide educational programming at the site. And it doesn't always have to be one that is, has the furniture of the forebears to it. That's the other reason why I wanted to talk about the 1800 house as just being an empty building that is now used, 7 days a week or 5 days a week with programming related to decorative arts and crafts or book clubs or what have you. It's a lively, vital space, for their community, but it isn't a traditional house museum.
Great example, Donna. I'll suggest Allison Tittman, who's the new executive director for the Alice Paul Institute. I think earlier. I don't know if she's still in the room, but the other one that's very much like that is President Lincoln's Cottage. We didn't talk about that at length. That house is not furnished, and that's intentional because when I worked on interpretive plan, we didn't want to get people, looking at doilies and talking about silver. We wanted them to talk about Lincoln's ideas. So we always had this sort of statement about the house is furnished with Lincoln's ideas. And that's what we wanted. What's the spirit of the place? Mm-hmm. And does that still have relevance and meaning today? Mm-hmm.
All right, we have another question that they're curious whether you all have any thoughts on getting younger volunteers, people in their 20s to 50s, involved in a world of 2-income families.
I want you guys to go first.
I wasn't quite sure I got that. How to encourage people to.
Well, I can say that the question actually came from someone who is a Pennsylvania colonial dame, and in general, the dames membership tends to be women who are 50 and older, who have the time, frankly, to be more active. I think it's a challenging conundrum at historic sites because there's always this sense that younger people should be able to be involved, but younger people are out pursuing degrees and have intense careers, and it's as they tend to pull back from that they're more involved.
And they have families and kids.
Got it. So, I think all of us want to bring in younger people into our sites. And I think that you have to be welcoming. And in our longer presentation, we give many examples of ways that you can bring younger people in to eventually get involved with your audience, but with your organization, but they have to feel welcome. So there have been a lot of events or sites that do, after hours parties for younger people. We do an after hours event at our Gropius house, where you can come in and get about 15 minutes of history, see the site, and have drinks and socialize. And that's been a trend that you've seen in a number of sites. Now that gets people involved, seeing your site, so at least they're getting to know you. And the idea is to cultivate them and then to bring them up. I think that's the question. How do you get them to volunteer? I know a number of sites, and we're doing this at the House of Seven Gables, that are bringing on graduate students onto our board. The Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts does that. We're doing that now at the House of Seven Gables. So it's bringing in someone in graduate school or young to come in and learn how to be a board member and to give us their thoughts. So I think, Laura, there's a number of different ways. I think that's actually a creative and good way of actually getting them. And, I've recommended it to a lot of, my students at Tufts, and people I know, is like, get on a board, you're young, it will give you some really great life experiences too. So
I wanted to add that, the whole issue of making some volunteer tasks into bite-sized pieces is one way, and plus to have, a job description for the volunteer is a way that you can create an environment where somebody gets introduced to the organization, have us, let's say that the task is we need a photographer for our 2 events coming up. And you might be able to get a young person that is interested in photography, can show you their work, that you're going to get a good quality job, but that, they would come to know the staff and want to be involved and do things more often. But I think that the whole notion of making volunteerism into sort of bite-sized pieces is really the only way we're going to get young people, because if it's not an online task, like, monitoring our social media or monitoring our Twitter account, we need people to do things for us that are convenient for them. So time is really a critical matter. So we need to make it easy for them to be involved.
Okay. Another question actually just came in. Should AAM accreditation be an important consideration? I think this means for house museums, or should the most important focus be on how the house can function best for the community? I find the accreditation comes first for many historic house museum professionals. And I would just start by saying Stenton is not an accredited AAM historic site.
What?
Yeah, no, we're not.
How are you still running?
That we, through the Dames, we're members of AAM, but we have not gone through that accreditation process. That it felt
too much
for our size and what we are, and we don't do climate control. We believe that our historic building is our primary artifact, and we're trying not to damage it to take care of the collection. How to keep all that in balance is a real kind of consideration.
So can I step in here, because I was director of a historical society for 14 years, and the previous director, that was like her goal. We were going to be accredited, and I made a very conscious decision that at that stage where we were, it was not the most important thing to do, and I did not act on it because I had other priorities. It's a lot of work to do that. If that is your goal, go for it. Great. But I really felt in my situation, I could use my time better. I would recommend steps very much. Yes. Thank you, Max. Holding it up.
Yes.
Much better, more relevant.
And maybe we can put that in the chat. If you're not familiar with it, go to the ASLH site. I recommended in our historical society in the town I'm living in now is going through the process now. It's getting them to those standards, but it's a much more manageable, you go at your own pace and so on. There we go. but it's
Yeah.
covering the main areas. I mean, it was devised to sort of correspond with accreditation. And if you go through steps and then you want to go through the other process, go ahead. But I personally would recommend steps.
As would I.
Okay. And then there's a question here that kind of relates a little bit to my colonial revival question, sort of thinking. Someone says, I keep learning from all of you. Many thanks. This question, my question is, how can managers of historic house museums better understand the difference between nostalgia and authentic history?
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
I'm putting the link for steps in the chat, so someone else
I've
start.
already done that, Ken.
Oh, you beat me to it.
Well,
Sorry.
I don't want to talk about nostalgia. That's why.
I know. No.
It's really hard because I think one of the things, Max, you talked about is the importance of emotional response and cultivating emotional response.
Mhm.
And nostalgia actually does go back to this kind of people having emotional, visceral responses to their sense of connecting to the past. And so I think actually nostalgia is not necessarily always a bad thing, but I do think it needs to be recognized because, and that's why I kind of ask if we have a colonial revival problem, because I think so many historic sites kind of came into being as part of the colonial revival, and this idea of celebrating the past as opposed to commemorating the past, also eliminating the parts that are hard to talk about, to me, are part of the colonial revival. And that sort of decolonizing historic sites has to do with telling the hard realities, often of the economic history, of oppression, in some cases it's slavery, whatever it might be, depending on your period and place and so forth. So that's where I just think it's important to recognize nostalgia and even know it in yourself, particularly as a historic site administrator. Just recognize when you're feeling it.
And you can use it as a tool too, because if you recognize that, Max and I are hopefully working on a book on the holidays, and that brings in a lot of people because of the nostalgia bit. But you could use it to teach. You can use it to your advantage sometimes to get people in, but we're about authenticity and we're about telling the truth as we know it. I think you can use it as a tool to get people in, but we shouldn't be about nostalgia.
Yeah, I would want to, when somebody brings that up, or if you can see that that's creeping into the conversation, you could talk about authenticity as being, what we're really like, or what we really strive for, but that it's necessary to tell the whole story. And the whole story is maybe not pretty. And that's the reason why the nostalgia is, sort of looks back on it as, with the rose tinted glasses or what have you. But I think if we make an effort to talk about, the folks that lived down the street, or the folks that worked in the house, black, white, purple, green, or orange, whatever color they may have been, is really a way for us to be truthful to what the historic site is. So if we don't tell the whole story, it's shame on us.
There's a challenge though, because the study that just came out from ASLH that Frameworks did for them on the National Study on Attitudes Towards History showed that it was pretty clear that the public in general does not want to talk about unpleasant topics, and they don't want to talk about minorities. Those are always secondary stories. And so we have to come up with a new way of talking about the past. One that is not confrontational, like, let me tell you about slavery if you're here, because we've tackled that as well. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that study to sort of see what's going on in terms of, we may want that, but what does the public want? Again, I talked about those circles, trying to find where they overlap.
Yeah, and I would say also look at what the information that Susie Wilkening is putting out there too. I think that that's really useful. And I think there might be actually some contradiction between the two, Max.
Yeah, that study is going to continue on. They're going to the next step and trying to frame What
Yeah.
are some ways that we can talk about the past that is a good entree to get to these bigger issues about
Right.
authenticity and holistic interpretation. I'm going to see if I can find that report and I'll stick it in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. Do you think innovation can get out of hand at historic house museums? It seems like some historic house museums turn to technology to become relevant, but it doesn't work because it's not tied to good interpretation. Do you have any examples of sites that failed when they reimagined their museum?
That's a good question.
Yeah, but I can't say their names.
I can give you an example of one that was really a historical society, but they had a historic house attached to it, and they were doing exhibitions in a gallery, but they sprinkled them throughout the house. But when one was done, an exhibition, which was bringing in some contemporary artists that had a theme, they took the main exhibition down, but they left things in the house. They did an exhibition on bicycles, and they started putting bicycles throughout the house. But then the modern art stuff was still there too, and so it was rather poor. That's an example, not with technology, but just trying to be creative and really not working at all. Yeah, Max, do you have any, or Donna, any examples where it doesn't work?
I'm seeing, historic sites that usually are very much either on their last legs or that just are having really hard time, like getting over the edge of saying, we got to do something different. So I don't really see that.
I'm putting in a good use of technology. If you put Eustace, I put it in the chat, Eustace.estate in your browser, you can pull up everything that's on the kiosks in our historic site, which includes some of the films of the restoration and how you want to dig into the house. So I can give you some examples of good use of technology. I would not use technology just for technology's sake. Right. At all. I am not a techie person. I think it has to really fit with what you want to convey. Going again, everything goes back to mission. But what's your story? Is this the best use of the medium? I think that's really important.
Yeah, as Cassandra said in the chat, it's form follows function. You need to know what you want to say first, and then you figure out the best way to say it.
Right.
To that particular audience, and every audience is different. Where things get mixed up is where people start with technology first and then try to cram it into an historic house museum. And that's just a bad way of doing interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Whether it's,
you mentioned artists as well. And so I'll ask this question about artists. Artists of all kinds, visual and performing, are eager for inexpensive venues in which to connect with the public. And they can bring their fans, i.e. new visitors, along to see what they're doing. Can historic properties become more proactive, engaging with artists individually or through artist organizations and commercial representatives to activate artistic activities inside or outside? Ideally ones that relate to the property's period/mission.
Yes.
So the answer is yes. Can I start with this and then someone jump in, because I saw that came from Peter Trippi, and we can talk more, Peter, but at Historic New England, we've been, and many sites do this, but partner with organizations or institutions for performances at our house. And we're hoping to do that with an exhibition actually that Peter Trippi curated at the Eustace Estate right now, Artful Stories. You can find that on our website. But I do agree, and I showed you a bit of a sculpture show that we're doing outside on the grounds to animate it. That's been working with the sculpture organization. So I think those are creative partnerships. Those sculptures are actually for sale. We don't handle the money, but we get a bit of the proceeds from it. And I'm working, and I think Peter and Max know this, and maybe everyone, Donna, knows. I'm doing a research project on artists in residence at historic sites very specifically. I think Cassandra's going to be doing some work there in New Orleans on that, and I'm happy to share these resources. We'll be doing a panel at ASLH. This wasn't a commercial, but I think it's really, I think really enlivens a house to have music, and again, appropriate. Having sculpture outside adds another layer to the house. I think that's great. Artists' interventions in a house can be very thought-provoking. Performances. There are a number of historic houses which, have done a Christmas carol moving around a historic site. I think those are all really good and creative ways of using a historic site.
But I would always push people to think that, to make sure, just like technology, a sculpture show can be the same thing. Someone will go, oh, I saw a sculpture show at this site, let's do one too. As much as possible, make it relate to, align with, advance your mission. Rather than just having another plop art show
right.
In your front yard. I mean, that diffuses your mission and
right.
conflict.
Yeah, whatever strategies you choose need to be integrated into your interpretive goals, that they can't just be like icing on the cake that's floating above. And that's what I think what you're saying.
Yep.
There are a couple questions related to kind of thinking about the end of the pandemic. Past pandemics have been followed by times of great social and cultural change. Have you given any thought to changes in our approaches to historic houses that might emerge from the latest pandemic? Is there something we did not think of before that the pandemic is prompting us to consider? And before you answer, the other one is more about the financial ramifications of COVID. So perhaps we want to, maybe it's easiest to take it one at a time. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we're discovering in, because of the pandemic, there's lots of things. One is that our usual reticence to use technology has forced us to deal with technology. I mean, take a look at this program. We're doing now, so many historic house museums are now taking their programs that they had before, putting them online and attracting a larger audience. Whether you're a national site or a local site, because you have local people that live different places now and want to see what's going on in their hometown or love their local history where they grew up. So it's a way of reaching new audiences. And I think that's going to continue, at least I hope so, because it's one way of expanding our reach. So I don't know, Ken, you see anything? Donna?
I'm sort of at a low moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass on that because I was answering a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think there's definitely things. I mean, lots of things, and are affecting us. We realize our collections need to be digitized to make them accessible.
Absolutely.
Realize the way we pay for things. We cannot rely on the credit card machine at the museum store. We've got to do stuff online with PayPal or something like that. So some of us are going to be better at it than others. Some of us have more access to the internet than others. But I think we all sort of took a pause, especially since it's been a year now, that we really have to rethink the basics about how we operate. And I would say that's what our book is about, is sort of rethink those assumptions, is to take it.
In one good way that people pivoted was virtual programming.
Yeah.
I mean, just amazing what you can do. And even very small sites were able to do that. I'll admit, Historic New England was actually kind of late to the game. And we're a larger organization with an IT team, but I saw smaller sites just doing it. I don't think it's ever going to go away.
No,
I don't. Maybe not to the degree that we are doing this now, but we're attracting people to our sites from all over, to our virtual programs from all over the world. It's really amazing.
Yeah, we can still be about places, but we can transcend place in going forward. So that other COVID question was, is there any good data yet on the financial ramifications of COVID and the economic downturn for historic house museums?
That's what I was trying to put in the chat.
Okay, in the UK, for example, the National Trust has proposed and made wide-ranging cuts, including staff reductions and significantly changing house use. Any prognostication for what is in store for US house museums? At the risk of being glib, will Max and Ken's volume on reinvigorating house museums or Donna's book on alternative use which one is, I think the last part is which one's going to end up being the bestseller.
Yes, yes. They may be picking up Donna's book more than Ken and my book.
Yeah, who knew? You know, who knew?
Donna, did you plan this?
No, I did not. And you know, this is just the joke of it all. You know, here I have the first volume, first edition comes out at the start of the recession,
Right.
and then the second edition comes out in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, good timing.
Like whatever.
Yeah.
I had nothing to do with that timing. You know,
Just if
nothing.
if people haven't seen, AAM has some predictions. If you go to their site, I disagree with them. They had said like a third of museums were going to close down. I disagree.
I don't see it happening yet.
Yeah,
Don't see it.
I actually know of one that was looking at doing that because of COVID, and they've rebounded and they're not looking at that now. I think the smaller places are used to working on a dime, and I
Yep.
think they're gonna be fine. I honestly do.
Yeah,
Might some,
I agree. That's one of the conversations, one of the chapters that got rewritten was with Tom Mays and talking about who's the general counsel of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And what we talked about was, you know, it was 12 years since the book had been written. And, you know, did he see a lot of change, you know, as a result of that, as a result of the book? Did he see a lot of people merging? Did he see a lot of people going out of business? And we both said no, because the reality is that the vast majority of historic sites are still run entirely by volunteers, and they have tiny budgets, and they can hold on, you know, in a way that a site that's got a $250,000 budget doesn't. You know,
Right.
they can do very, very different things. So,
Right.
you know, when you start to look at who really are the folks that are saving these buildings and trying desperately to open them to the public, they're still all run by volunteers, and they can actually weather the storm because they're so tiny.
Great.
So Donna's anecdotal sort of observations are backed up by a study I did in an article in a National Trust forum I did 15 years ago, using actual financial data from Forms 990. And you could see that the smallest sites, small sites, did fine, no deficits. They may have a small budget, but they had no deficits.
Right.
The big sites, big places, have big endowments, doing just fine. It's the
Right.
ones in the middle that
Oh,
have the
scary.
worst time.
Yeah, that's very true. And the existence of an endowment, let's say, you know, more than 100,000. I mean, 40,000 is going to be helpful, but not like 100. But still, you know, if you have any endowment whatsoever, that's going to make a fundamental difference about what the future is of the historic site. But without one, and you're trying to put together, you know, all of your programs, you're earning all your revenue one dime at a time, just makes it so hard.
Well, we have hit 5 o'clock. There is one more question that maybe you three would have particular advice for this person about. How do you, it's phrased a little oddly, but how can you help convince boards and administrations that change is needed? There is so much resistance, and many times those people feel they know more than the people who have worked in the field for years and don't want to hear anything you have to say.
Donna, you wrote the chapter on boards.
I know. You know, there's a famous quote in the Main Street world, which is sort of how I spend the other half of my time as a consultant. And it's always that change is really 3 funerals away, meaning that sometimes it has to have board members that will actually be moved off the board for you to actually see change. And so, I mean, not that we want to see ill to anybody, because we don't, but sometimes it may just take time for, you know, succession planning to actually, or succession to actually happen.
Succession to succeed.
Succession to succeed.
Yeah.
And-
So the other thing, when I hear these questions, they're not uncommon. Is I always think about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a psychologist who wrote, what, 50 years ago? How long ago?
Yes. Yes.
About the stages of grief.
3.
Yeah, stages of grief. And the first stage is denial. And the second stage is anger. And the third stage is bargaining.
Yeah.
So there are these 5 stages she laid out, and finally 5 is acceptance. So just to remember, I always think about that. It takes a while for people to get through the first couple of stages. Unfortunately, I'll type in the chat though some books that I found helpful to think about, sort of models for thinking about changes in organization. And one is written by John Cotter at the Harvard Business School, and the other one's Robert Cialdini, who is a social scientist that I found both very helpful.
And I'm going to add one thing, and that is sometimes no matter how good you are and how good you are at working with your board to try to convey this, sometimes you bring in an outside, quote, expert, and they'll tend to listen more.
Yeah.
And I've seen that happen.
In your own town.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. So it's not easy, as Donna and Max said.
And the other bit is to remember that most of the people who are very involved with historic sites do it out of passion. You know, they love being involved, and if they're professional, they love what they're doing. And so that's where the intensity comes from. That's both, you know, it's sort of the flip side of that. Well, we do have a few more questions. I think maybe I will just ask one, which is, what are you hearing about or doing yourselves? Are you experiencing a lot of land acknowledgements, and should historic sites be thinking about doing that, and how?
Land acknowledgement?
You know, Native American land acknowledgement.
Yeah, I've seen it done in different ways. Some people do it at the beginning of the tour, or they have an interpretive panel. I mean, all of where we have historic sites, no matter where they are in the world, people have lived there long before our historic building was put there. Is that part of your history? Probably in some way, but that's getting, you know, that requires us to expand beyond what I call before the default. Let's go to the first original period, the first builder of this house, and going broader. So, yeah.
Some historic sites note that on their email. You know, that's fairly easy to do if you know, you have to look at all the options. And as Max said, you know, interpretive panels, it's what's right for your site, what's right for your community. I think it's, you know, we're grappling with that. I think a lot of sites, Historic New England is grappling with that. A lot of sites are, and I think I need some good examples. I don't have them. But that's a great question. I'd love to see someone do a panel or write an article about that. So why don't you take that on, whoever wrote the question?
It needs to be authentic.
Yeah.
And not simply a token. Oh gosh, let me look on Wikipedia who the Native Americans are from my town. Type that into a panel somewhere. Yeah, you probably have to have a discussion with all your volunteers about why you're doing this and why it matters.
Yeah, and for Stenton, it's particularly important because the builder of the house, James Logan, was an orchestrator of something called the Walking Purchase of 1737 that ended up essentially dispossessing the Lenape of a lot of their lands, kind of in the Bucks County kind of region of Pennsylvania. And so I think as we look to work on our interpretive plan, I think really authentically acknowledging that will be part of our process going forward.
Yeah, so you may encounter uncomfortable stories when you do that. So, but that's part of our history. And unfortunately, it's the Lenape. I was doing a project in Indiana, and I ran into the Lenape again because that's where they were relocated. They've been relocated like 14 times in their history. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so awful. So.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank all three of you for spending this time with us today, for presenting your work and your thinking, sharing your practices, and I hope that the audience has gotten as much out of it as I know I have. And so I'm just very, very grateful that you've been with us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks.
Terrific.
Everyone have a good weekend. Thank you for coming.
Great weekend.
All right. Good to
Bye,
see you.
everyone. Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye.